So I have a very good friend, Arlen Brownstein, who for 30 years has been my personal physician. She's a naturopathic physician and also a great animal lover. She lived for many, many years in the Bay Area and then up in San Rafael. And she worked with the Marine Humane Society. And they would give her really, really sick kitties, just 3 or 4 weeks old. And then she'd nurse them to health, using naturopathy and homeopathy. And then when they were, at a particular weight, they could be adopted out. But any animals that were too sick, that didn't fully recover, she'd keep herself. So she always had 5 or 6 cats. So I remember one of them, and he's still alive, a guy called Sugar Ray. She called him Sugar Ray. And at this stage, she's living down in San Rafael, and she's got a back garden for the cats. And this little kitten is going out, and he's learning to hunt. So firstly, he's hunting autumn leaves. He's chasing them around the garden, and he's spearing them with his claws. And then he'll bring me through the cat door, and he'll put her down in front of her feet, like as an offering. Mama, look what I caught. And then at some stage, he graduated from flora to fauna. And he brought in a mouse and laid it at her feet, and she's kind of screaming. But she got it that, he was trying to say thank you, for what she has done for him. And an animal, cats particularly, it seems to me, can think of no greater compliment than to make us one of themselves. It's like they induct us into their species, by treating us as they would treat another cat. So he's giving her, a gift of a mouse. Now, what do you expect her to do with it? I have no idea. But this was his way of saying, Mama, you're one of us. Now, in the same thing, the greatest gift any creature can bestow on us is to make us a member of their group. And we do the same thing. And in fact, that's how we treat God. We think that the greatest compliment we can offer God is by making him one of ourselves. So we've created this superhuman in the sky onto whom we've projected our greatest ambitions and virtues, and also our greatest fears and our greatest vices. So if you study the gods that we've created, while claiming that we've been built in the image and likeness of God, we've actually created gods in our own image and likeness. And we project all our stuff onto them. So love, nobody loves like God. Jealousy, nobody can be as jealous as God. Justice, nobody is as just as God. Vindictive, nobody is as vindictive as God. And so I just finished writing another book, which has gone off, hopefully, it's gone off to a publisher. Whether they'll accept it or not yet, I have no idea. And I called it Setting God Free, in which I went through particularly the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures, and comparing the behavior of God to the Bible of the psychological community, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, showing that God is a total psychopath. So that we've created this God in our own image and likeness, and we've projected all this shadow material that we haven't dealt with as individuals, as communities, as nations, and even as a species. We've projected that onto God, and that's the God whom we follow in fear. So we constantly kind of bring our autumn leaves and our dead mice, and we lay them at the feet of this God whom we've created and anthropomorphized in our own image and likeness. And so that's what I want to examine in the first lecture today. I want to ask myself the question, who is God? Who is the God we've created? And is that really who she is? And how has that image of God changed throughout your lifetime? I'm going to set us an exercise for the afternoon about how your image of God has changed over different phases of your life. So I want to do that for all of us this morning, and then you can do that as individuals this afternoon, or if you choose to work in little groups, you can do that to examine what your notion of God is and how your notion of God has changed throughout your lifetime. So the first thing I want to examine then is God and language, the ways in which we talk about God. And there are basically 3 languages that we employ, 3 very different languages when we talk about God. The first one is called cataphatic language. These are Greek terms. And cataphatic language is the language used by theologians. It's the language that attempts to articulate and define who God is and what her or his qualities are, and what distinguishes God from others. And so they get into kind of paroxysms of debate about, for instance, some ridiculous notions like how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, and that kind of ridiculous detail, attempting to tell us who God is, what God had for breakfast, and what upsets God and what God loves, all these things, all of which are made up. Anything we say about God is made up. And so, for instance, the first councils of the church in the 4th and 5th centuries, went into extraordinary detail trying to define who God is. For instance, and there was the great split in Christianity occurred in 1054 over a single Latin word. And trying to decide what the relationship is between God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, which are, again, they're totally made up categories. We've created this trinity of persons, and the Latin and the Eastern Orthodox Church and Western Roman Catholicism differed about how they proceeded from each other. So the definition in the councils was that the Father is uncreated and unbegotten. The Son is uncreated but begotten of the Father. And the Spirit is uncreated and begotten of the Father and the Son. Now that's where they brought it. Now what does it mean to be uncreated or unbegotten? Your guess is as good as mine. And what does it mean that the Father is both uncreated and unbegotten, but Jesus is uncreated but begotten of the Father? And the Holy Spirit then is uncreated and begotten of the Father and the Son. And the word that's used in Latin, of the Son, 3 words in English, it's 1 word in Latin. It's called filioque. And so the Latin definition was that the Spirit proceeded from the Father, filioque, and of the Son. The Eastern Church disagreed and said that the Father is uncreated and begotten, the Son is uncreated and begotten of the Father, and the Spirit is uncreated and begotten of the Father only, not of the Father and the Son. And this was such an important debate that they split ranks in 1054, and then they went to war with each other, and they literally killed hundreds of thousands of the other side over this dispute. And it was only resolved in our lifetime. This lasted 900 years, this schism between East and West on the basis of a single Latin word. That's the craziness of cataphatic language. I think it may have been Paul VI and the Patriarch of Constantinople or Istanbul who finally kind of forgave each other and mutually unexcommunicated each other and finally went into dialogue. After 900 years about a single made-up word on a made-up concept. So that's what happens when you start, trying to talk about God in cataphatic language, trying to determine or trying to make up, theories about who God is in herself. So that's the first kind of language that gets employed when you're talking about God. The second kind of language is very different. It's called apophatic language. It's the language, of the mystics. It's the language of Lao Tzu that I mentioned last night, where Lao Tzu says, those who say don't know, and those who know don't say. So those who don't know and say anywhere are the theologians who, tell us how many angels can dance in the head of a pin, or how the Spirit proceeded from the Father and the Son, or just from the Father alone. So in Hinduism, this concept is captured by the phrase neti neti, no, no, or by the idea that once you identify a characteristic, you have to say, no, this does not represent God. X, God is not X. Y, no, God is not Y. Z, God is not Z. So by refusing to kind of identify God with any characteristics, you're backing yourself into the experience of God, in which language becomes unnecessary. And so the whole notion of the Zen koan, where they ask these totally ridiculous kinds of questions, the object of the exercise is to make a discussion of God so irrational that you give it up and you back yourself into the experience. So when you ask somebody, for instance, what is the sound of one hand clapping? There's no rational answer to that question. Or what did your original face look like before your grandparents were born? It's a Zen koan. It's meaningless because there's no rational response to that. You have to go trans-rational Not become irrational to respond to it, but trans-rational. You've got to go beyond mere reason in order to engage with this at an experiential level, at a heart level, or at a soul level. So the whole purpose of the Zen koan is to be apophatic and to kind of give you an experience, to force you into an experience that you can't subsequently articulate because it is basically ineffable. Meister Eckhart, probably the greatest Christian mystic ever, said famously, "I pray daily to God to rid me of God." In other words, any theology we make up, any theory we have of God, get rid of it before it kills you, because it's going to stultify, it's going to result in some kind of fundamentalism. So get rid of your notions of God and settle for the experience of God. Buddhism has the same notion. They say, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. In other words, if you think you've understood the Buddha or you've understood the divine, kill it before it kills your spiritual ongoing evolution. So again and again and again, it's the reason why there's a third kind of language, and it's the language of the teachers. So theological language doesn't work. It's not going to give you an experience of God. It's going to bring you off in diversions. And apophatic language is just going to say neti neti, no, God is not X, God is not Y, God is not Z. But if you're a teacher like a Jesus figure, or if you want to try to share an experience you had of the divine, or where you were had by a mystical experience, if you want to try and share that with somebody, you're going to have to use some kinds of words. And so there's a third kind of language, which is neither cataphatic nor apophatic. And I would call it parabolic, the language of parable, or the language of metaphor, or aphorism, or proverb. And so I'm totally convinced that if you want to understand the wisdom of any culture, if you're an anthropologist, or you're just a visitor in a foreign climate, and you want to understand the culture into which you've been parachuted, the fastest way to understand the culture is to go to their stories. If you immerse yourself in the mythology of a culture, the mythology is the archived wisdom of the group. And if you want its most pithy rendition, go to their proverbs. The proverbs are the one-liners that capture the mythology of the culture, which is the archived wisdom of the community. And so that's what the great teachers have to resort to. They have to resort to story, parable, aphorism, proverb. And Jesus is a master at this. And so he will never speak in theological language, or he'll never engage in philosophical debate, or he's not going to get into scientific discussions. He's going to speak only in parables. And then you're free to unpack this according to your ability. Wherever you are in your spiritual journey, you're going to unpack this particular story very, very differently. And at various stages of your own journey, you'll go back to the same parable, and you'll see totally different levels to this parable. And so what he's trying to do is avoid literalism by speaking in parables that can be unpacked in a whole variety of ways. So then there are three kinds of language. So we have to be really, really careful, that if we kind of stray into cataphatic language, into the language of theology, we know that we're playing a game. It may be great fun to discuss all the possible theories, but it's not going to get you nearer to God. What's going to get you nearer to God is the neti neti, the praying daily to God to rid you of God, or, the notion of storytelling or sharing experiences, or some kind of an art form. You can dance the experience, you can draw pictures of the experience, you can tell stories about the experience, you can create proverbs about the experience, but you can't articulate the experience in the language of theology, philosophy, or science. So it's important to realize that when you do share your stories. I wanted then to examine my own kind of reconstruction of how we created the gods, with whom we're in relationship. So there's a big difference in evolution between Homo sapiens, which happened about 150,000 years ago, and Homo sapiens sapiens, which only happened about 70,000 years ago. Homo sapiens is thinking beings. They were reasonable, they could rationalize, but they didn't have language. And so they couldn't manipulate concepts intracranially. that only came with language. So language only evolved about 70,000 years ago. And language gave us the ability to manipulate symbols inside our own heads. That's what language does for us. And therefore to be able to articulate, to be able to pass on an experience. So, the greatest linguist of the 20th century, I believe, was a guy called Ferdinand de Saussure, a Swiss linguist. And he claimed that language had three parts. He called it the referent, the signified, and the signifier. So I'm out in the bush in East Africa and have an experience. And I'm going to try to come back to you and communicate what the experience was. And so I have the experience. And so the experience of the real animal in the real world, he called the referent. So I have an experience and I create this image in my head. And the image can be olfactory, I smell it. It can be tactile, I've touched it. It can be visual, I've seen it. It can be auditory, I've heard it make sounds. And so I describe to you now, I came across this huge creature and had these huge big tusks and this long proboscis and a tiny little skinny tail, and it was this kind of real rough skin. And so what I've done is I've had an encounter with the referent being the thing in the real world. I've created this internalized image that he would call the signified. And now I'm going to use symbols to try to communicate to you what the referent actually was. And they're the signifiers, the words. Either I'm going to paint a picture, or I'm going to imitate the sound it made, or I'm going to try to describe what it was for you. So, they're the three parts. Then that language is this extraordinary ability where we can have an experience in the real world, create an image internally, and then somehow transfer that image from my mind to your mind by using language of various kinds. So that only happened for humans about 70,000 years ago. Now, I'm totally convinced that the first use to which we put language was storytelling. That we sat around fires in East Africa, probably Kenya, Tanzania, and we shared stories about the experiences we'd had in the course of the day. This creature that, I'm going to call Ndovu if I'm using Swahili, or, an elephant if I'm using English. And so we're going to communicate the experiences we've had. And we very, very quickly then set about looking at the existential issues. Where did we come from? What happens when we die? The life expectancy at that stage was in the mid-20s. People died in their 20s. At that stage. So what happened? We're constantly surrounded by death. And where did these people come from? Women gave birth to children in blood. And we had to figure out, where did that baby come from? They hadn't made the connection between coition and conception yet. That only came, I believe, with the domestication of animals and the domestication of plants. We begin to see the correlation between mating, and birthing. We didn't understand that before. And so babies would come screaming and in blood. And so they had to figure out, where did they come from? And the belief system was, there must be some creatures, and this woman stole this creature from the gods, and she did it in a bloody fashion, and they're going to be really mad, and they're going to come looking for the baby. And so we had to give the baby back. The firstborn had to be given back. Child sacrifice. Subsequently, you could keep whatever else came. Any other baby you could keep, but you had to give back the firstborn to the gods. So a whole kind of theology emerged out of this notion. So we then created, somebody must have, created this baby, and somebody must have created the mountain and the rivers. So who are those guys? What do we call them? And how do we be in relationship with them? So now we begin to create gods. And I think we created three classes of gods, three different kinds of gods. The first one I would call regional gods. So it's like, if you move into a particular geographical location, there are gods, who own that property. And now you have to pay obedience to that particular god. So they're like the local mafia. So you have to kind of offer them sacrifice of some kind. And so if you move into an area, you have to pay obeisance to the gods who own that area. And if you move to a different area, you have to then placate the gods in the different area. And particularly colonialist powers. The Romans were really, really good at this. When Romans conquered any culture, they made it important that the local people kept worshipping the local gods. The Romans did not want to upset the local gods. And so they wanted to pay obedience to whatever gods they found in the local areas. And that was the difficulty the Romans had with Christianity. the Christians were refusing to pay obedience to the local gods. And the Romans were afraid that these local gods would then come down and punish everybody, including the Romans who had moved into the territory. So the first, I believe, group of gods we created were regional divinities. The second group, I believe, were tribal divinities. That there are now gods who are nomadic themselves, and they follow the nomadic tribes. They take a particular interest. A particular god takes a particular interest in a particular group of people. So the Hebrews believed that they were chosen by a god called Yahweh. And wherever they wandered, whether they were taken into captivity in Egypt or wherever, this god followed them about and was their particular god. So now you've got tribal divinities as well as regional divinities. So this was a nomadic divinity who wandered around with his particular patrimony. And then thirdly, you had what I would call portfolio gods. There were gods who specialized in particular kinds of activities. So there were gods who specialized in war. And if you really wanted to be successful in war, this was the guy, like Mars. He was the expert god on war. Or you had gods who were expert on art. You want to be a great artist, you need to follow this particular god. Or you're interested in sexuality, there are gods, Aphrodite or whatever, that this is their shtick, or Venus, this is her shtick. Or gods who were interested in agriculture and good at agriculture, and then this was the god you needed to follow. And this led to a huge division in Judaism about the year 800 BCE, when after they had conquered, the land of Canaan, and they're now settled, but they're experiencing drought after drought after drought. And they come to the conclusion that Yahweh is really, really good at making war, but he's really, really poor at agriculture. And so they now change their affiliation, and they start following the Baals, who were the gods of agriculture. And this is the famous debate with, the great prophet Elijah. Elijah is actually a nickname he gave to himself. The Hebrew version is Eliyahu, which literally translates as Yahweh is my God. And there's this great contest on Mount Carmel where he's debating with the prophets of the god Baal to see who's really the top god. And Yahweh wins the contest. And so Elijah has the 450 priests of Baal taken down to the river Jabbok, cuts their throats and kills them to sacrifice them to his God. So the Israelites are constantly wondering, is Yahweh the best deal we can do? Is there a better deal we could have, with a different God who's got a different kind of, portfolio? So this is the third kinds of gods. So you've got regional divinities, you've got tribal divinities, and you've got portfolio divinities. So that's kind of the evolution of our notion of God, I believe, as we evolve as human beings. I think then that whichever God we tend to follow, that is going to go through four distinct phases. Our relationship to this God or these gods, if we're still polytheistic. And the first era, I call it the era of the theologian. It's where we invented gods, or we believed in a particular God, and we spent all our time talking about the God. Who is he? Where does he live? What pleases him? What displeases him? So we're talking, the theologian's task is to talk about the gods. The second phase is the phase of priesthood. And now this is not talking about the gods, it's talking to the gods. So now we're going to invent prayer, and we're going to invent sacrifice as a way of being in relationship with these gods. We're not just talking about them anymore. That was the job of the theologians. Now we're priests, and we're going to talk to the gods and offer sacrifices and create rituals to create a relationship with these. And then the third great movement will be the movement of the prophet. And the prophet purports to speak not just about the gods or even to the gods, but to speak on behalf of the gods. I got a message, God told me, and this is what you guys are going to have to do. And so now the third phase is the prophet is going to purport to represent the God and to speak on behalf of the God. And that's pretty much the stage we're still at, I think. We're moving into the fourth phase, which is the phase of the mystic, I believe. So the mystic does not speak about God or to God or on behalf of God. The mystic speaks as God. Because the mystic realizes there is only God, and that every single one of us is an articulation of the divine. So the mystic is gone way beyond the ego. So it's not some kind of an egoic claim to special status. It's the realization that there is nothing except God. that everything that exists, every daffodil, every mountain, every river, every avatar, every angel, every human being is God in drag, a manifestation of the divine. So we're speaking as God. And then finally, there's the kind of the non-dual mystics, they don't speak even as God because they don't speak at all. Because they realize that anything you say is inadequate. And so maybe it's stage 4B. If stage 4 is speaking as God, stage 4B is not talking at all. And that's the Lao Tzus of the world, perhaps. So they're the stages, I think, that, when you, believe in a particular God, there's the stages that you're going to walk yourself through. So the final realization then is that we are holographic fractals of Source. That, for the purposes of experiencing, God needed to self-fracture. So the Trinity for me doesn't represent the Father, Son, and Spirit. It represents our best attempts to look at the isness of God, God's total, self-knowledge, and God's, love for whom she finds herself to be. So there's the existence, the self-knowledge, and the self-love. And so Hinduism will call this Sat, Chit, Ananda, being, knowing, and loving, or blissing about what you find. But there's this fourth stage that needs to come, because God knows completely who she is, God loves totally whom she finds herself to be, but she cannot experience because there's nothing which is not herself. And so she creates this game. Hindus will call it Laila, the game of self-fracturing and kind of shooting off sparks of herself who pretend to not to be God and experience the separation from Source. So everything that exists in some senses is merely God playing the game of Laila, experiencing that which is not herself, until finally all those pieces of herself that are pretending not to be herself realize that they are herself. And if I'm being really kind of, what's the word I'm looking for, confusing here, I'm doing it on purpose, because there is no language to articulate that which I'm trying to articulate. Yeah, but so that's the movement of mysticism. So then we wrestle between these two notions of pantheism and panentheism. Pantheism is the belief system that God is the sum total of all that is. And I don't subscribe to that. I much prefer a notion called panentheism, which is God is the sum total of everything that exists, and a lot more about which we can say nothing or even know. And the example I use to illustrate this is pantheism is to panentheism as Hamlet is to Shakespeare. Hamlet is just a particular work of this genius called Shakespeare, who produced a whole bunch of other stuff as well, sonnets and plays, and had a whole bunch of other ideas that never even made it to paper. And so panentheism is the belief system that God indeed is the sum total of everything you can ever experience, but a lot more that you can't even experience. Now, in this evolution of our notion of God, there have been particular periods in human history where we seem to have been fascinated and made great strides, where our models, as I said last night, we can't make accurate models, of God. All we can do is make less and less inaccurate models of God. But there was one period in human history, and it's called the Axial Age. And it's roughly from 800 BCE to 200 BCE. And it seemed like the whole world was awash in the wind of spirit. And so beginning away in the East, you had people like Lao Tzu and Kung Fu Tzu in China. You had the Buddha and Mahavira in India. You had Zoroaster in Persia. You had the great Jewish prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. You had the great thinkers of Greece. You had Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. A little bit later you'd have Jesus Christ. But at this period, there seemed to be some extraordinary movement in the human psyche to break through from the old models of the gods to a new understanding. And like all great movements, they were regarded in that time as total heretics, because they were refusing to worship the old versions of the God, and therefore they looked like they were atheists who were rejecting God. They weren't rejecting God, They were rejecting these totally inadequate models of who God might be and trying to wrestle with a new notion of God. So I really, really believe that we're in a new axial age, that in our times, and that the reason that we're living with so much confusion in our world, so much violence in our world, whether it's economic injustices, whether it's political turmoil, whether it's genocidal behavior of the military-industrial complex, whatever it is because nature never makes a significant breakthrough in consciousness which is not precipitated by some kind of a global crisis. You know, if we easily resolve our issues, what we do is we put band-aids on problems, but we go back to sleep. It takes major crises, major global crises to wake us up as a species so that we break through into the next stage of human consciousness. So it's either going to be a breakdown or it's going to be a breakthrough, which is the importance of what little groups like ourselves are trying to do all over the world. Create cosmologies which are adequate to our times, that wake us up as individuals, wake us up as communities, wake us up as nations, and wake us up as a species. So we're going to break through and become, divine beings who recognize the divinity in all other beings and be able to say, really, namaste to an oak tree or a mountain or an enemy. The God in me recognizes and honors the God in you, or we're going to break down and human species will be wiped out and nature will just throw up some other species which hopefully will do what we've failed to do, recognizing the divine in all. So that's kind of the trajectory as I can kind of reconstruct it. So I want to go into the kind of the apophatic language in particular and say what I believe God is not. So by kind of dismissing all of these false notions that we have of God to see if we can back ourselves into the experience of the God who is. So some of the things God is not, I do not believe in this dysfunctional parent whom we meet in Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3, who threw Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden, for eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. I talked in church a few Sundays ago about a famous social psychology experiment where, an experimenter takes a little child into a room. There's hundreds of children involved in this experiment, and they're typically children between age 2 and age 4. And he sits the child down in a very comfortable environment, and he puts a beautiful cookie on the table, and it's creamy and it's got icing on the top. And the experimenter says to the child, I need to leave the room for a few minutes. This cookie is for you. But if you can wait until I come back before you eat it, I'll give you 2 cookies. And then he goes out and he's watching through a one-way mirror the behavior of the child. And it's fascinating to watch the child, depending on how old the child is and how long the experimenter is absent and how good the cookie looks. The child is sitting there, and then after about a minute, he looks around to see, is there anybody watching? And he goes, what does it taste like? Look around to see anybody watching, nobody watching. So after a little bit, he'll kind of take it out and give it a few licks and put it back down there, look around. Nobody's still coming. And so he turns it upside down, he takes a bite or a bar and puts it in his mouth and puts it back on the table. Nobody's going to notice. And then if it's really too long, he can't wait anymore and he's just going to eat it. And then the experimenter comes back in and says, what happened to the cookie? Oh, the dog ate it. There's no dog in the room. But, so the ability to defer pleasure, it's something we all have to learn. I had a really upsetting experience as a small child. I'd say one of the most traumatic events in my life. I'm age 4, I'm living with my grandparents. My uncle is 2 months younger than me, Noel. We're still best buddies. And my grandmother was actually a fantastic chef. She worked in a big hotel in Cork City called the Metropole Hotel, if you know it, Neil. And occasionally the pastry chef would give her pastries to bring home. And this day she brought home these 4 beautiful pastries. And there was only Noel and myself in the house. So she said, okay, I'm going to give you 2 each, but we're going to toss a coin. So we toss it, and the person who wins the toss gets the first choice. And the other person gets choice number 2 and 3, and then the person who got the first one will take number 4. So she tosses the coin, and I win it. And one of these pastries is really, really, really hot. So I want that one. So she gives me that. So Noel gets number 2 and number 3, and then I get number 4. And number 4 is, it's a pastry, but it's heavy, as we say in Swahili. So being the little greedy bastard that I was, I start with number 4, and I'm just very slowly eating it while Nolan's gobbling up number 2 and number 3. So that when he's finished number 2 and number 3, I can attack number 1 and say, nah, 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 nah. So I'm licking very slowly. I'm eating number 4 very slowly. Noel finishes number 2 and number 3. I've just finished number 4, and I'm reaching for number 1, and my aunt comes in, Teresa, who's 2 years older. And my grandma says, give that to Teresa. You had one already. I couldn't believe my luck. I am watching there, my eyes are like saucers. How could this happen to me? I didn't do nothing wrong. I would say it's probably one of the most traumatic events of my childhood. Yeah. Yeah. So I realized that deferring enjoyment doesn't work. So I always eat the cookies first before the dinner. Right. So it never made any sense to me that God put these 2 creatures in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve. They're literally little infants psychologically. They cannot distinguish between good and evil or deferring pleasure. It doesn't make any sense to them because they haven't eaten yet of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that will educate them and allow them to become rational beings. So it's like God brought them into the garden and he said, you're not, see that tree, that beautiful tree in the middle? You're not allowed to eat that. It's like saying to a kid, you see the cookie on the table? You're not allowed to eat the cookie. There's cabbage over there, and there's broccoli over there. You can eat as much broccoli as you like, and there's carrots. You can eat as much carrots as you like. Do not eat the cookie. And then he leaves the garden, and of course, they eat the cookie. They go straight for the tree. And it's only after they've eaten it, they develop the ability to be able to distinguish between right and wrong. But God kicks them out of the garden anyway. It doesn't make any sense to me that God is this totally dysfunctional parent. So that's the God that I do not believe in. Nor do I believe that God is this cosmic psychopath who got so upset with human beings that he decided he was going to wipe out the whole experiment. He was sorry he made it. And he wiped out everything. The only lucky ones were the fish that could survive in the flood that happened. Everything else gets wiped out. He just saved 8 people, Noah and his wife and their 3 sons and the wives of the 3 sons. Everything else gets wiped out. There's no way I can believe that God is this cosmic psychopath. I can't believe that this is a God who plays, who instigated and mandated genocides against the Canaanites or the Hittites or the Girgashites. There's a whole list that's repeated again and again and again in the first 5 books of the Tanakh and Torah. That again and again and again mandated. It's called the ban, where you have to wipe out every man, every woman, every child, every ox, and every ass. So there's no way I can believe that this is God. I cannot believe that God is partisan, that he has a chosen people, or that, that there's only one true church, extra ecclesiam nulla est salus. Outside the Catholic Church, there's no redemption. I can't for a moment believe in that. I can't believe that the intelligence which invented a universe of 200 billion galaxies, each of them containing somewhere in the region of 150 billion, stars, most of which we now realize have planets in attendance, which are Earth-like, that somehow God is peering down through this extraordinary cosmos and is picking up one particular galaxy, the Milky Way, and saying, I got a special relationship with the Milky Way galaxy. And in this galaxy, I got a special relationship with this particular sun. We call it our sun. And of the planets in attendance on that particular solar system, I have a particular relationship with this little planet here. And of all the tribes on that planet, I got a special relationship with this particular group of people. It doesn't make any sense that any thinking being could believe in that kind of a partisan God. So that's a God I do not believe in. I do not believe in a God who is a creator. That a God who comes into his workshop one morning says, today I think I'm going to create a rhinoceros. And he creates a rhinoceros. And then tomorrow he gets into his workshop and says, today I'm going to make flowers today. And he creates flowers. And then on day 3 he says, let's have a bit of fun here. I'm going to create mosquitoes today. And then he creates mosquitoes on day 3. For me, everything that exists is actually an emanation from source. It's not a creation ex nihilo. It's not bringing into being that which did not previously exist. I agree with Plotinus, who said, it is not creatio ex nihilo. It is not creating from nothing. It is emanatio ab Deo. It is emanation from source. And I've used this example many times. Some years ago, somebody gave me a gift of a bulb which was set in a pot with soil in it. And I keep forgetting what the name of this thing is.
It's Amaryllis.
Amaryllis. And she said to me, very simple, I said, I'm deadly with plants. I kill them. Either I water them too much or I fail to water them and they die on me. So she said, very simple. Stick your finger in the soil. If it's wet, leave it alone. If it's dry, water it. That's all you have to do. And after about 3 or 4 weeks, suddenly this huge big green stalk began to emerge. And after 3 or 4 weeks, these 4 beautiful purple flowers, trumpet flowers, began to emerge. Now, it wasn't that somehow that the bulb created the stalk and the stalk created the 4 trumpets. It was that built into the essence of the bulb, was the manifestation of its own potential, which was to manifest as a stalk and then as trumpet flowers. It didn't create these things from nothing. It emanated and manifested from its own essence. And for me, that is what I think creation, what we call creation, actually is emanation from God. It's like an articulation of the isness that is. So it's not created. They're not being created in discrete acts by a God inside in a workshop. I do not believe that God is either a lawmaker, a lawgiver, a law enforcer, or a law punisher. I think, as we said last night with this great discussion with Maria, that, there are what we call cosmic laws, with a C or a K, are inferences we make from our experiences of how the universe in which we find ourselves, how it works. But God isn't making particular kind of dictates and saying, this is, how I'm going to create gravity, and I'm going to create electromagnetism, and I'm going to create karma. He's not creating all these things. It's that, God gives us intelligence to infer from our experiences principles that allow us to live in love. That's basically what the exercise is to be able to use our God-given intelligence to infer from experiences how the universe works, and it works basically on the principle of love. I do not believe that God is a person, or even 3 persons. Again, that's a mistake. The notion of 3 persons was a mistake as we moved from Greek to Latin to English. So initially, the Council Fathers, way back at the beginning, are trying to understand not who God is in herself, but how we experience Source. And there are various ways in which we experience it. So they use the word in Greek prosopon, and it's taken from, from the thespian experience, where actors on Greek stage would come on stage and they had different masks to tell the audience what kind of a character they were playing. So if I came on stage and I had a mask that looked like this, the audience knew I was playing a comic role. If I came on stage and I'm wearing a mask that looks like this, they know that this is going to be a really dramatic, a painful action. And so the mask was the clue to the audience as to what kind of a character they were going to experience. Now, that word was prosopon. When it got translated into Latin, it was translated as persona, literally because the original mask had holes for the eyes and holes for the mouth, so you could speak through it. So when that gets translated into Latin, it's translated as persona, that through which you make sound. Sona means sound, and per is through. So persona means that through which you made the sounds, so that the audience could hear what your lines were. Now, that word persona gets translated into English as person. And we think person is like, Neil is a person and Mary is a person. We think a person in that sense. That was not the original. It was like, what character is God playing in this particular experience? Am I experiencing God as just? Am I experiencing God as punitive? Am I experiencing God as loving? Am I experiencing God as humorous, whatever? And so we now take this notion of person and we identify it with our own experience of being people. But it's not that at all. God is not a person. Now, the interesting thing is we have personal experiences with God, but that does not make God a person. I live in the middle of the forest 10 miles from here. I have a personal experience with the forest. I spend hours every day just trekking in the forest, watching stuff, watching birds, watching spiders, watching the river. So I have a deep personal relationship with the forest. But the forest is not a person. But the only relationship I can have with the forest is a personal relationship because I am a person. And so the only relationship I can have with God is a personal relationship because I'm a person. But that doesn't make God a person. But we continue to try to anthropomorphize God. and then ascribe all kinds of characteristics, good, bad, and indifferent, to her. So that's the third section there. Section D, then I call it the tug-o-war. So as we move in our journey back to source, for me, religion is the training wheels for spirituality. And spirituality is the training wheels for mysticism. Now, when a little 3-year-old girl is learning how to ride a bicycle, it's appropriate that she have training wheels that she doesn't fall off and hurt herself. But if she's still using training wheels when she's 15, we got a problem here. So religion is a very important part of inducting newborns into a wisdom tradition. But if we're still tied to the apron strings of Mother Church in our 30s and our 40s, we got problems. Now, that is not to say that we don't need community. We do need community. But religion per se has outlived its usefulness if we're still attached to Mother Church, who tells us what to believe and what to think and what's going to happen to us when we die. We're in big trouble if we haven't, transcended that. And my favorite example of that is when I look at the life of Jesus. There's the two great mysteries of the Rosary, the joyful mystery of the Rosary. One is in which they bring the newborn infant, 8 days old, to the temple to dedicate him to God. And then there's an incident 12 years later when he gets lost in the temple, and his mother gets really upset with him and says, "Why did you do this to us? Your father and I have sought you in sorrow." And Jesus responds as a 12-year-old, "Did you not realize I must be about my father's business?" So in the first instance, he's born into a particular tribe, into a particular wisdom tradition, and it is appropriate that he get inducted into that ceremonially. We do it in Christianity through baptism, that a child is inducted into the family of believers, because a child needs training wheels. They need some kind of a wisdom tradition to get the journey started. But at age 12, with self-reflection, we've outgrown our initial wisdom tradition, not in the sense that we've rejected it, but we need to kind of cross-fertilize it with other wisdom traditions until we find the core essence, the core truth, which is trans-cultural. And that's what the child Jesus was doing at age 12, saying, I thank you for introducing me to this wisdom tradition. I've outgrown it. I'm now going to investigate other traditions. And there's esoteric belief systems that he may have gone to, wisdom schools in Egypt. He may have gone to India, studied Hinduism or even Buddhism, that he may have gone to the Celtic lands, Cornwall in England, and studied with the Druids. I don't know how true any of those are, but I certainly believe that that kind of an avatar was going to very, very quickly outgrow a single wisdom tradition and transform and take aboard all of the insights of all the great wisdom traditions and then find out what the core essence of that is. So that's the journey that each one of us is meant to make. But religion won't allow us to do that. And very often our culture won't allow us to do that. They want us to remain in the religion of our birth, or be ethnocentric, my country, right or wrong, whatever the country happens to be, for the rest of my life. And when we do bad things to other people, it's because we're spreading democracy. When they do bad things to us, it's because they're terrorists. Your best friend in school was a Protestant, but she couldn't get to heaven. No matter how good she was, she couldn't get to heaven because she wasn't Catholic. So if we're still stuck in that kind of a milieu, we're in trouble in our adult life. So often what happens, instead of religion moving into spirituality and spirituality moving into mysticism, religion even regresses. It begins to regress into a form of fundamentalism. And then that determines all the relationships in our lives. So when we're caught in fundamentalism, our relationship to God is based on fear. We're afraid of God, what he might do to us. If we break the commands, we'll wind up in hell. Our relationship to other members of the group are based on law and dogma. And our relationship to people outside the system are based on prejudice and xenophobia. So instead of religion progressing to spirituality and ultimately to mysticism, it regresses to fundamentalism. So fundamentalism then for me is the antithesis of mysticism. It's starting, to use the kind of the integers, starting at 0, instead of going from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to positive infinity, it's going to -1, -2, -3, -4 to negative infinity. We're going in exactly the opposite direction we were intended to go during incarnation. And fundamentalism does this in 4 steps. Whether you're talking about fundamentalist politics, or fundamentalist business practice, or fundamentalist religion. It always proceeds in 4 steps. The first step is you take a very complex idea, like God, and you reduce it to a few bumper sticker one-liners. That's always the first step. You reduce something which is really, really complex and beautiful, and you reduce it down to simplistic one-liners. The second thing is you have to identify an enemy figure. There has to be an us and a them. Thirdly, you have to dehumanize the enemy. They're not really human beings. And the fourth one, then you have to slaughter them. You're actually doing a mitzvah. You're doing a holy thing by killing them because they're not actually really human. They are the four steps of fundamentalism. You see that in our political system, you see it in our religious system, you see it in our economic models. Mysticism does exactly the opposite of that. It goes in exactly the opposite direction. It starts with cataphatic language and it moves into apophatic. It starts with trying to describe who God is and what God had for breakfast. And we move into a much more complex language, which is the apophatic language, listening and learning and realizing that God is not. That's the first step. The second step, instead of identifying or creating an enemy, we identify neighbor. And we realize that everybody is neighbor to us. And one of the lectures that we'll do, today is understanding what does neighbor mean to us. The third step then, instead of dehumanizing the enemy, you're offering namaste to the neighbor because you realize the neighbor is you. And the final phrase then is, instead of waging war, you operate out of unconditional love. So you got the four opposite steps when you're moving from religion to spirituality to mysticism that you employed when you were in fundamentalism, from going from complex ideas to simplistic one-liners to identifying an enemy to dehumanizing the enemy to slaughtering the enemy. So a final kind of a metaphor. Religion is a bus on which people tend to huddle for safety. And very, very often the drivers of the bus want to kind of pull over slowly, put the engine into the gear lever into neutral, kind of sidle over to the side of the road and stop and be safe. Or sometimes even put it into reverse and go backwards. That's the tendency of religion. The tendency of mysticism is to get off the bus and get out and walk. Think for yourself and create a personal cosmology. And core to that is how you wrestle with your notion of who God is. Namaste. So maybe we could do 10-15 minutes discussion and then get out into the sunshine. We have another lecture, I think, at is it 11:30? 11:30. So let's do about 15 minutes of question-answer discussion, and then let's get out into the sunshine. Johanna.
Well, there's two things I'd like to see really fast. You can answer either or none. The first one is the quickest. What if we left children alone and not taught them religion? They're already mystics, so that's part one. And then part two is, so when people used to give homage to the regional god, like the god of the hill or whatever, and that got changed and morphed into different things over time. Now we might think that's silly, but there's also the thing about Australia where you can't go through the country till you recognize what is there. So there are maybe presences in the hill, and maybe there are entities that hover over war that like it, and maybe people would be sending that energy to us.
Right. Two great questions, Joanna. So the first one, what if we left kids to their own devices? Now, I'm convinced that there's a cycle to nature, and that this process of, killing the mystic in the child, is accelerated by our education system and even by the way we raise kids. But even left to their own devices, eventually they're going to go through that phase. If you've ever read, what was the famous one about the kids who were on a desert island? What was the Lord of the Flies? That left to their own devices, kids will naturally graduate from the mystical origins into personal selfishness, into playing favorites, into creating kind of cliques and whatever. They'll naturally go through that cycle. There's no way of avoiding it. Now, I think that if we had a proper educational system and if we were treating our kids differently, we could massage that evolution to make it less traumatic and less destructive societally. But the kids are going to experience that, leaving left to their own devices. So there's no way of avoiding it completely. think we can soften the blow, and accelerate kids through that process perhaps, so they get out the other side more quickly. But it's unavoidable in some way.
Taught like Summerhill, that different method of teaching kids.
Okay, I don't think we can avoid it completely. I think it's a natural progression that kids have to go through. They have to reach the absolute nadir of separation from source in order to begin the journey back to God. But we can accelerate that process. Your second question, about regional divinities as distinct from, it's a very different thing to think that the sun is God, or that, that there's a particular divinity who's in charge of Ireland. That's very different from offering namaste to a mountain or a river or an oak tree. The recognition that inherent to every life form is a divine essence. But it's not, confined to the oak tree, or it's not belonging to the mountain. A mountain is an articulation of it. An oak tree is a manifestation of it. But that this great spirit, there's always some notion of an overarching spirit, in all these great kind of shamanistic cultures. The great Sioux nation had their own particular term. What was it called for the great spirit? Every great shamanic culture had a notion of an overarching, essence, which was responsible and which kind of peered through everything. But in offering a homage to the mountain, I'm not saying the mountain is God. In offering homage to the sun or the stars, I'm not saying the sun and the moon and the stars are God. I'm saying they're manifestations of God, just like everybody around me is. So it's a very important, subtle distinction, which is misunderstood very often by Westerners and Western anthropologists. When Westerners, I think, encountered, for instance, Hinduism, and they came across this polytheistic culture that believed in, 10 million gods. Hinduism was not teaching 10 million gods. Hinduism was teaching 10,000 different ways in which we experience the gods and naming those experiences. And the Aborigines of Australia weren't worshipping, the god of the mountain as distinct from the god of the ocean. They were worshipping the God who manifested here as a mountain and here as a stream.
Things today that really resonated with me and kind of really resonated with my own personal journey. One of those things is, I know growing up we were encouraged to read different things, like Socrates, but we were also disencouraged to not read certain things like Kierkegaard. And it's funny, well, it's not really funny, but now I have a better understanding of Kierkegaard by what you said, because it was Kierkegaard that said, if you name me or you label me, you negate me. But those people were not rejecting God. It was like, well, they haven't been rejecting God, and yet we were being told not to read. Like Immanuel Kant was another one, don't read Immanuel Kant.
Totally.
And so it was just profound that you said that. It's just another confirmation. But the other thing was I remember back in 2006, just getting up one morning and thinking, when I was doing my own spiritual journey and seeking, what if I wasn't even born in America? I just started questioning that. Would I even be thinking some of the things that I think?
Absolutely.
And then again, you said the same thing today. So that was kind of the genesis of my own spiritual journey, was realizing,
that's beautiful.
I could have been born someplace else.
Absolutely. The good news, Trish, you were born someplace else. For me, this is for me is the great understanding of reincarnation. That the human journey is so different depending on cultural circumstances, gender, skin color, language, literally linguistics, that, I believe that we're actually living not so much sequentially in reincarnated versions of the soul, but with parallel existences. That, when nature is faced with any significant choice between A and B, it chooses both. And it spins off a universe in which it follows through the consequences of having chosen A. Now, when it comes to a choice having chosen A, when it meets a choice between C and D, it chooses both as well. So every soul, I believe, affords itself as many opportunities as it wants until it's capable of loving unconditionally, no matter what circumstances it finds itself in. Whether I'm born as a slave girl in North Africa in the 1300s, or I'm born, into a CEO's family in Silicon Valley in 2019. Unless I can learn to love in all configurations and all circumstances, I really haven't, understood the function of incarnation. And I'll talk about that tomorrow when we treat the topic of mission. Why are we here? That's a great insight. Ingrid, and then Karen.
One of the words that you used yesterday I really respect is paradox.
Okay.
Because when a mind is being a metaphysical information junkie,
Brilliant.
the more you know, the more you realize you don't know.
Absolutely.
It's the tip of the iceberg.
Absolutely.
And it's not just to get fixated on an answer.
Right.
It's the question and the
Okay.
mysteries that live within these questions. And my other thing that I loved when I heard Neil Donald Walsh interviewed on Coast to Coast with George Norrie. He did a 2-hour interview about his books of God.
Right.
So George goes, tell me at the end of the interview, what do you really know about God? How do you know that? He goes, I could say this in 5 words about God. You got me all wrong.
I remember a very upset Catholic mother bringing a kid into me in my psychology practice years and years and years ago in Los Angeles, really upset with this kid. He was only about 11 years of age because he decided to become an atheist. And she wanted me to kind of straighten him out. So she drags that kid, kicking and screaming into my office in Los Altos. And she said, you know, he's given up his faith, he doesn't believe in God anymore, I don't know what the hell I'm going to do with him. And so we sit down, the three of us sit down together, and I said to the kid, you know, tell me, you know, about your journey. And he's telling me all the reasons why he doesn't believe in God. And he talked for about 20 minutes. And I said, you know what? The God you don't believe in, I don't believe in either. Okay. The mother, that's not what I'm paying you for. It's absolutely right. You know, anything, you know, if we can, everything we say about God is at best metaphorical, at worst is going to trip us up. I tried to quote another great philosopher, you know, when the guy who went out in the street shouting, what was his name? God is dead, God is dead. What's his name? Nietzsche. God is dead. Nietzsche, for me, was making a mystical statement. Nietzsche was saying exactly what, you know, the Buddhism was saying, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. Or what Eckhart was saying, I pray daily to God to rid me of God. You know, if you think you've understood God, it's going to kill you because you're going to become fanatics and fundamentalists and you're going to impose your will on a whole bunch of people. And so the very, very notion that, you know, that we think we've understood God, it's crippling us. And the typical George Norrie to want a one-liner to kind of sum up a 2-hour interview. Karen, you know what I mean?
So we were, Alex and Valerie and John Paul and I were talking this morning about middle school and kind of the journey of middle school. And your middle school children are between 11 and 14 years old. And sort of it triggered for me when Johanna was talking about a place like Summerhill, that this is kind of a necessary passage, that there's no way to protect children. So what they're reenacting is all of their notions of love and appreciation and power and manipulation. And when they go through that, particularly, I was wondering if you had something to say about this particular ages between 11 and 14 that they're coming around to. So they will make this situation for themselves in order to evolve.
Absolutely.
Even though it's incredibly painful.
Absolutely. Right. It really is part of the contract of incarnation. There's no avoiding it. There's a way of smoothing the journey. There's a way of accelerating the journey. There's a way of supporting the kids in the journey. But any attempt on the part of parents or culture to shut down self-reflection, you know, to stop kids asking these questions of themselves or of their culture, you know, is a tremendous disservice. We have to have patience as educators and patience as parents, you know, to allow kids to go through that process because, you know, they have to experience the absolute nadir of incarnation, which is ultimate separation from source in order to begin the return journey of evolution. You know, and if we stop them, there's this great image, it's actually a true event, of a little child watching a monarch butterfly trying to work its way out of its cocoon. And a monarch butterfly, you know, so it's in the cocoon, it begins breaking it out and is struggling really, really hard to kind of free itself. And this little kid is watching, and 10 minutes into the struggle, the butterfly still isn't free. And 15 minutes into the struggle, it's still not free, it is still struggling. So in compassion, the little boy figures, I'm going to help it out. So very, very tenderly, he starts breaking asunder the remaining cocoon to set the butterfly free. And finally, the butterfly is out. And it's crippled for life. Because it's the struggle of working its way out of the cocoon that releases the lactic acid into the wing structure of the butterfly that allows it to fly. And the absence of that struggle, it doesn't have the necessary ingredients in the wing structure, and he's crippled. So that's what our kids are going through at that stage. You know, they have to make the struggle to come out of the cocoon of the family system or the cultural milieu. in order to kind of develop the lactic acid that will allow them to fly. Yeah. Mary Kate,
You're touching something else. What about the difference between a natural birth and a C-section?
I was
Oh,
just
brilliant.
thinking that.
That's
Mary.
brilliant. Fabulous.
Just thinking that.
It's fascinating, obviously.
Yeah.
You know, I actually assisted at a cesarean section in Kenya one time. In one hospital I was attached to, we just did a generator and a lightning strike knocked it out. And there's a woman from my tribe, and they had to do a cesarean section on her. So literally, there's a nurse holding a hurricane lamp. With cesarean section, there's a local anaesthetic. The person is knocked out. I'm talking to her in her language. There's got a sheet between her and her belly, so she can't see what's happening. And I'm trying to talk her through the process while they're cutting her open. So there are some situations when obviously, you know, a cesarean section is necessary. But from everything that I know and have read, there's a whole bunch of issues that result from it. That firstly, literally, the juices of the birth canal create all kinds of immunity in the child against diseases subsequently. And the struggle for being born also, I think, is part of the psycho-spiritual journey of the little child. And when we kind of airlift them out, you know, and that's not to make any judgment of, you know, people I've known. I have a godson who was delivered through cesarean section, and he's a great kid. But so it's not to say that, you know, they're going to be lesser than anybody else. But it's certainly another environmental factor in determining the psychological evolution of the child. And we got a pediatrician right here in our midst. Do you want to make any comment on that, George?
It's all true what you're saying.
Okay.
There's just a lot going on.
Right. Yeah.
After the
Birth process.
But,
Right.
some of the Aboriginal people really do a lot
Right.
of connecting with that baby. The Navajo like to shake hands with the baby.
Brilliant.
And of course we and others suckle.
Yeah, right.
And all that plays together with the hormones.
Right.
Process.
Brilliant. Thanks a million. Doug.
So I can understand believing that God is not, vindictive and covenantal and doesn't have a chosen people. But how do you reconcile that with Scripture, which so clearly, in some of those instances, states otherwise? And so if you're talking to people who refer back to that in Scripture, how do we look at Scripture?
Right. So that's a great question. And the truth is that, there are many different scriptural traditions. We got the Upanishads of Hinduism, you got the Pitakas of Buddhism, you got the Quran of Islam, you got the New Testament of Christianity, you got the Tanakh of Hebrews, all making different claims and all saying to us, some of them particularly, if you don't follow our scriptures and don't do it our way, you're not going to get to heaven. So, as Trish was saying, we just have to be born into a Christian milieu. If we'd be born differently, we'd have a totally different mindset. So are they damned? So that forces us then to re-examine, as Christians, our own scriptural tradition. And as I said last night, we believe that the scriptures are the inerrant word of God only because an authority figure told us they were, who learned it from other authority figures. Now, when you actually look at the notion of inerrancy in the scriptures, you have to realize that it exists on an entire spectrum. So there's one group of people, for instance, that hold that the scriptures are just inspired by God. That God kind of whispered in the ear of Moses, or Matthew, or John, some idea. And then John recorded it in his own way. Because John, contradicts Matthew and Mark in some of the stories. So it's just that God inspired people and then left it up to themselves to articulate it. That's one theory of inerrancy. The next theory says, no, God got much more involved than that. God dictated the text and said, no, put a comma here, put a full stop there. So that's a second level of inerrancy. A third level of inerrancy is the belief system that the scriptures are only inerrant or infallible when they're speaking about morality or ethics. But they're not inerrant when they're speaking about geography or history or science, because there are huge faux pas that Scripture makes, geographically, linguistically, scientifically, huge mistakes it makes. That's the third position. There's a fourth position that says, no, God's word is inerrant, and it doesn't matter whether you're reading about science in the Bible or geography in the Bible or, the flood in the Bible. It's absolutely inerrant. It's exactly, what it means. And the fifth position is, not only is it inerrant, but the man in the street can take up a Bible in an English translation and read it, and it means exactly what it says. And then there's actually a sixth and seventh position. There are people who claim that, no, you have to read it in the original language. So for instance, in the Quran, you can't translate the Quran. You can attempt to put it in another language, but you can't translate it, because the belief system is that it's actually the sound of the words in Arabic that create the revelation. So unless it's recited, you can't even read it in Arabic. It has to be recited in Arabic in order for you to be in contact with the revelation. The belief system in Christianity was that there is only the original versions of the Old Testament, which were written mostly in Hebrew and some passages in Aramaic, that only when you read it in the Hebrew and Aramaic, only that is inerrant. But any translation we can't vouch for. And then there's a group called the King James Version only, that say that that's true, except the King James Version was actually also revealed by God in England, and that if you read the scriptures in French, or German or whatever, it's not revealed. But if you read the King James Version in English, any other English version doesn't work, only the King James Version works. And Roman Catholicism went one stage further. In the year of about 400, a great scholar called St. Jerome translated the scriptures into Latin, from the Hebrew and the Aramaic in the Old Testament and from the Greek of the New Testament. And he gave us a translation which is called the Vulgate, meaning the common language, Latin. And the Catholic Church believes, and they defined this at the Council of Trent in 1546, that the only valid translation of the Judeo-Christian scriptures is Jerome's translation, and any other translation is not inerrant. So when you think about, is the Bible the revealed word of God? You believe it because somebody told you it was, who was told it was, who was told it was, who was told it was. And which camp did they come from? Was it the fundamentalist camp that every single word is revealed, and only the King James Version in English is? So you have to exercise your own intelligence and think, if it is the revealed word of God, do I really believe that God mandated the genocide of a whole bunch of people? Do I really believe that God, wiped out the entire planet? Do I really believe that God was this vindictive creature who even killed Moses alone on a mountaintop? Moses, who allegedly led the people of Israel through the desert for 40 years and acceded completely to every single command of God, except once he got impatient. And what happened was this: the people had no water, and they're complaining they have no water. And Moses said, "What do you expect me to do? We're in the desert." And God says to him, "Hit the rock, and water will come out of it." And Moses took his staff and he hit the water, and he hit it a second time. And for that sin, God said to him, "You got impatient with me. You didn't believe I was going to do it. So for this reason, I'll bring you to the edge of the Canaan, but you'll never get in there." So he brings Moses right up to the top of the mountain, Mount Nebo, looking into the promised land, and he says, "Have a good look, because you're never going to make it." And Moses died with nobody around. Nobody knows where Moses is buried. So is that the kind of God you believe in, this vindictive, vitriolic, cosmic psychopath? There's no way I can say that this is God. This is the God we've created. I come from a storytelling culture. My grandfather was a Shanachie, a storyteller, who filled me up with all the great Irish mythology, going way back into pre-Christian times and even pre-Celtic times. I went to Africa. I learned in my lifetime 6 different languages. I immersed myself in the mythologies of the Kalenjin people of East Africa. And I find the same themes again and again and again all over world mythologies. The same kinds of stories, the same kinds of heroes, the same kinds of bloody battles, the same kinds of genocides, the same kinds of special relationships that you find in the Hebrew scriptures. And I'm not being in any way anti-Semitic when I say this, but if Judaism hadn't given birth to Christianity, and I believe that Christianity is one of twins, that when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, and it was the end of priesthood, it was the end of sacrifice, that the dying mother gave birth to twins, one of which became subsequently, rabbinical Judaism, and the other became Christianity. Because of the phenomenal success of Christianity, in becoming a worldwide religion, this little book of mythology that we call the Bible, it would have been unknown apart from just the Jewish people. Like, for instance, Judaism has another book which is much more important to Jews than the Bible. It's called the Talmud or Midrash. These are the stories that the rabbis kind of, where they try to exegete the stories from the Bible. But most Jews I've ever met, they don't use the Bible as their source of inspiration. They use the Talmud. But the only people who know Talmud are the scripture, the Talmudic scholars, the rabbis, the ultra-Orthodox rabbis who spend their lives in yeshivas poring over what Rabbi Nachman said about this, and Rabbi, Mendel Moses said this, and that's their spirituality. Now, nobody outside Judaism knows anything about that book. Nobody outside of Judaism would have known anything about the Old Testament if it hadn't been for this phenomenal success of this little offshoot. But it is basically a mythology created by nomadic people to try to make sense of their experiences of God. And they're beautiful stories. Once you understand mythology, fundamentalist scientists do not understand mythology, and fundamentalist religious people do not understand mythology. Scientists kind of dismiss mythology as kind of the ravings of pre-rational cultures. And fundamentalists mistake mythology as the literal word of God. As somebody who's steeped in mythology in so many different traditions, I know that mythology is neither. Mythology is the archived wisdom of a culture in story form. Not to be taken literally, but to be taken inspirationally, so that we have heroes and heroines, and we know what happens, when we're out of alignment with our ideals. And that, for me, is what the Bible is about. It's not about real things that actually happen to real people. The Bible itself was actually constructed, 700 years after most of the events which are described in it. So you're going on tribal memory, you're going on tribal folklore, you're going on people trying to make sense of their present experiences and inventing heroes like Moses. Moses never existed. There's not a shred of evidence that Moses ever existed or that the exodus out of Egypt ever happened. Israeli scholars, particularly after the Six-Day War in 1967, when for the first time ever they against owned Jerusalem and they owned the entire Sinai Peninsula. Hundreds of different projects combed the Sinai Desert for any evidence that there had ever been an exodus of 2 million people that resided there for 40 years. They didn't come up with a single human skeleton or a single artifact demonstrating that a group of people had ever passed this way in those numbers. It was an invented story. In the year 539 BCE, when the last two tribes of Israel are struggling for survival and they're trying to create a mythology and heroes which will allow them to survive after their exile in Babylon and now the onslaught of the Persians and the Greeks, and they're trying to create a mythology that allowed them to make sense of their experiences and survive. We did the same thing in Ireland. They did the same thing in Africa. The Native American people did the same thing. But we have to look at their mythology and see it as inspirational and that which affirmed them and supported them and allowed them to survive, but not take the stories as literally true and not dismiss them as the ravings of a pre-rational culture. And with that rant, I'm going to set you free for the sunlight. Okay.